Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about dexterity, declared deity, and devil in details. We're going to manipulate the size of weapons for fun and profit. One of the things that you've explained to me that you enjoy about Pathfinder is how things feel equivalatable to each other. It feels like there's a relatively standard currency by which weapons can gain damage. For example, we're going to talk about this table later, but having a dice progression and relatively equivalent bonuses for weapons that are relatively more difficult to use means that it feels like things are quantifiable in some way, and yet still open-ended enough that you can come up with your own open-ended, creative, satisfying, personal ideas. And the system knows what to do with them. You can come up with something weird. What if I make these greatswords smaller so I can dual wield them? And the system says, oh great, yeah, that does this much damage. Nice, like that's satisfying. You can come up with something satisfyingly open-ended, I think appropriate for a tabletop role-playing game. That is one of the strengths of the genre, and yet it has a numerical corollary. I'll tell you all that a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, I was talking with you all during a stream, and I said that I thought that I wouldn't enjoy playing tabletop role-playing games because what I liked about making builds was working within limitations that breed creativity. Having everything be interpretable and open-ended sounded like a way to make set builds, set types of build making less satisfying. It would make it less of a static target, and it would feel less like there was stuff to synergize with. This parlay is a really good example of I don't think that anymore. I was definitely wrong about that from my perspective anyway. And this parlay is a great example of why. Creating a system that's open-ended in a way that the player can kind of fiddle, but which still has rules that you can reference to translate that into game mechanics is really cool. I think that does things even better. I think some of the better build making you can have is in tabletop role-playing games. And their derivatives, like Baldur's Gate 3, I think is one of the stronger build making experiences available currently. And it is essentially 5th edition D&D with some very good homebrew changes. Anyway, so this parlay is going to be about that, but specifically size, manipulating the size of weapons to accomplish various tasks while still working within the game's restrictions. Pathfinder. Asymptomatic begins, EyePatchNotes begins. That's your name on the stream, and I'm in that headspace now. It has the concept of appropriately sized. An appropriately sized mount, for example, is one size larger than the rider. A large horse for a medium human, or, it says this will be on the test, a medium wolf for a gnome. Are we going to make a companion and then use them as a mount? Anyway, manufactured weapons are appropriately sized for one size category, such as longswords manufactured for medium users specifically. However, inappropriately sized mounts and weapons can still be used as long as the disparity is not too great between the intended size and the actual size. Now, just as a note, since I've never played Pathfinder, I gather that what you're saying is that for a given weapon, it will be labeled saying what size it is meant for, because some traits in Pathfinder seem to care what size a weapon was intended for. You can use it if it's the wrong size, with some various penalties, but not always. For example, we're going to go on to talk about how you can't use weapons as finesse weapons unless they are the correct size for the wielder. So I assume that weapons are labeled this way. When you find a longsword, it says, manufactured for a medium user or whatever, something that doesn't sound as strict and futuristic as that. This was designed for a medium wielder, a medium creature or whatever. Cool. Okay, that's a useful thing to keep in mind. So we get various advantages if we don't use anything that restricts us to using an appropriately sized thing. We can use a wide variety of weapons. So this parlay has It has three main sections, but then there are two examples that I thought were really good as their own sections. So I'm going to do 5 short sections. We're going to try to do that. I surreptitiously eyes the timer. We'll see, but I think they flow pretty cleanly into each other, so that's how I think it will be the most fun. Section 1 is called Dexterity. Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition's versatile property, it's a weapon property, lives on in Mathfinder as the option to hold a one-handed weapon, strength, 1 times 1.0. It takes your strength multiplier 1 time, 1x, and you can wield that one-handed weapon with 2 hands and get your strength multiplied by 1.5 times. In 5th edition, versatility is not good on weapons. I'm confident saying. Usually it would be something like 1 dice notch up. So if you have a quarterstaff, you could use it with 1 hand and do 1d8 or whatever damage. And if you hold it with 2 hands, you could do 1d10 damage. Using your strength, which is probably bad if you're playing a spellcaster or whatever. So you definitely do not get 1.5x your strength multiplier. Although, if that's just the damage added, maybe it's surprisingly similar. That sounds better to me, is I guess what I'm trying to say. I feel like versatility is kind of bad anyway in 5th edition D&D, and one of the reasons is that people often don't keep track of what is in their hands very keenly. In 5th edition D&D, there are kind of rules for this sort of stuff. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in this parlay, there are sort of rules and equivalents for, but they're not good, in my opinion. They're not very clear. I reckon that 90+% of players do not use real rules on sort of what is in their hands, besides this is the weapon I'm using, and if it's two-handed, I can't hold a shield or whatever. But for example, in 5th edition spellcasting, you need to do a somatic component. Flip them the devil horns before you cast your fireball or whatever. You need a hand free for a lot of spells, most spells. And so it's not that uncommon to have a quarterstaff. You hold it in just 1 hand, cast your fireball or whatever, and then you could maybe grip it with 2 hands again and you get like a little free damage, I guess. And maybe the reason that it's weak is because it's like free a lot of the time. I mean, it's sort of not, there are lots of, look, this is a convoluted mechanic in 5th edition. It's not that important to this parlay. The main point is it's not that keenly balanced. And I think one of typical of affectionately nicknamed Mathfinder, Pathfinder seems to have systematized that much more. I play with quite strict what is in your hands rules in my 5th edition games. And I think that they make the game more interesting. They are like a good balancing mechanic. They create interesting build decisions and opportunity cost, but the game doesn't do a good job of that. And understandably, I think almost all players don't use it. It sounds like in Pathfinder, that would be much less of a thing. Like people do know about this. It matters a lot whether you're using a thing with 1 hand, and 1.5x your strength multiplier feels like enough of a bonus that you would sometimes want to use a finesse weapon, a versatile weapon. We're going to get to that in a second. A versatile weapon with 2 hands. That could be significant. There's always the case that I've been turned on to mostly with playing Baldur's Gate 3, where maybe you have a magic item, a magic weapon that does something you want to do, but your build doesn't want to use a 2-handed weapon or doesn't want to use a 1-handed weapon, but it's versatile, and so you can just kind of switch. And if the damage gains are like reasonable, then that could be a powerful property. Anyway, however, EyePatchNotes continues, light weapons can never be held in 2 hands this way. In exchange, they can be used in harrowing circumstances, like when being grappled, and with weapon finesse. Finesse is a feat in Mathfinder rather than a systemic clause like in 5th edition D&D. All melee weapons are strength-based unless a character possesses an ability or feat that rules otherwise. Yes, even daggers and other light weapons. There's a further requirement that the weapon must be appropriately sized for the wielder. Finesse is in this way a property of the character rather than of the weapon. So in other words, for you to use a weapon with dexterity instead of strength, a melee weapon with dexterity instead of strength, it has to be light, and you have to have like the finesse feat or an equivalent. You can't do it innately, and even if you can do it for some reason, you still have to have a weapon that meets the requirements. It's got to be light, and it has to be intended for your size. So to use dexterity to fight with a dagger, not with strength, but skillfully by using dexterity, it kind of makes sense that the dagger has to be the right size for you to do that. And for the damage to scale with your dexterity skill rather than your strength at hitting someone with it, it now is important that it's the right size for your finesse, for your techniques. Whereas with strength, I mean, if it's bigger, it does more damage. Fine, if you're able to swing it. That makes sense. Cool, that's elegant. I like the idea that finesse is a property of the character rather than the weapon. Okay, but of course, for our purposes, weapon finesse, dexterity scaling on weapons, thus locks the character to using a specific size of weapon, putting a hard cap on the dice-based damage they can deal. There are some exceptions that bend the rules on what weapons are allowed to use dex, but the safe assumption is that dexterity finesse scaling weapons are subpar in terms of both strength scaling and dice without additional player input. Yes, I am generally wary of these options that just allow you to do something in a less specific way. I am usually not making builds to do things in a non-specific way. That's kind of an oxymoron in a way. And so a lot of the time, these types of abilities that would enable you to use a weapon like scaling with something out of the ordinary, usually I'm only turning to these when I'm in a situation where I have some very powerful thing I want to do, but there's just one missing piece, which is that, let's say, I can't use weapons with dexterity. But if I can, my build has some very interesting, cool thing it can do. If only that one piece was fixed, then I would more use this as a kind of like a keystone thing rather than, oh, I'm going to, regularly have my characters scale weapons with dexterity. That seems like a big cost. They aren't even going to be able to be as effective with weapons. And I also have to pay a feat or whatever just so I can use the weapon with dexterity. Now, of course, if it's at all similar to the way it works in 5th edition, this is actually a pretty interesting balance patch because the way 5th edition makes dexterity work makes it almost impossible not to invest much in. It works with your initiative, how early you go in combat. It works for your armor class, unless you wear heavy armor. So for most characters, their armor, how often they get hit, is based on dexterity. Their ranged weapon damage, and because finesse is a quality of melee weapons and not characters in 5th edition, also likely their melee damage. In other words, basically all of their physical damage and basically all of their defense, except for saving throws, comes from dexterity, meaning you're probably going to build dexterity. It's not a good design choice, in my opinion. I get that some stats are meant to be more useful than others. I don't think that's a bad design decision, but this isn't like that. It's rarer for the system to use these stats. This is, you can't use basic game mechanics without building this stat, So Pathfinder has done an interesting thing where if you've played 5th edition, it sounds like a heavy nerf to dexterity, but remember that dexterity is stonked beyond all reasonability already, and so you can nerf it quite a bit and have it still be pretty good. For example, what I was getting to is, I would imagine that one of the advantages of getting finesse abilities in Pathfinder is that you can now, because of that feat, have your armor class scale with the stat that scales your melee damage. You unlocked that ability. Imagine a feat that did such a thing. There's a stat for your armor class, how often you get hit, and there's another stat for how much melee damage you do. And you can take a feat that says, these are now the same stat. That sounds pretty good. That sounds powerful. And in this system, it's been recontextualized to be that way. And so it might sound harsh that dexterity is getting such a drop in damage output. But whether it's that specific example that I just guessed, that's how it would work in 5th edition, or some more general example, I would imagine that there are subtler benefits to being able to use finesse weapons, probably not benefits to the weapons as often as much as like a stat economy thing. Like you can build less stats and get the same effects. If you're poorer, your build concept is poorer on stat points than it is on feats, then maybe, I feel like it won't be, but I don't know. That's just my 2 cents about that. The next section I want to do is about sneak stab. EyePatchNotes says, to go into a lengthy case of size manipulation, we can look at the Knife Master subclass for rogues. They have an ability called Sneak Stab. A Knife Master focuses her ability to deal sneak attack damage with daggers and similar weapons to such a degree that she can deal more sneak attack damage with those weapons at the expense of sneak attacks with other weapons. When she makes a sneak attack with a dagger, karambit, kukri, punching daggers, star knife, or swordbreaker dagger, she uses d8s to roll sneak attack damage instead of d6s. Whew. For a sneak attack with all other weapons, she uses d4s instead of d6s. This ability is identical in all other ways to sneak attack and supplements that ability. A natural reading, EyePatchNotes continues, is that the rogue can step down their base damage die to 1d4 for sneak attack, but increase it to however many d8s for, dagger sneak attacks. If the rogue is going to land one juicy hit, the weapon's actual damage will quickly be lost in the delicious sneak attack packet. The idea here is that if you do a pile of, it would be d6s on your sneak attack, your one qualifying hit per turn, then the 1d4 damage of your dagger is quickly irrelevant as you roll, 5d6s to figure out what your sneak attack damage is. If your dagger had been a longsword, 1d8 sounds a lot better, but when you're also rolling 5d6s, is it really that big of a deal? And so this feature allows you to give up that raw melee damage and invest it into sneak attacks. Your default melee damage is going to have to be much lower, probably in d4 territory, but in exchange, when you do a sneak attack, all those d6s become d8s. That's a very reasonable trade. And as you say, it makes sense on the surface. No frills, this is just good. I don't really like the idea of this feature in one way, which is that I feel like the sneak attack with all other weapons scaling down is just pointless. Like, I don't like these features that reward a very specific playstyle, but then they feel like they should take the time to sort of punish other playstyles that you almost for sure will never use. You know what I mean? Why would you pick to be a Knife Master subclass rogue and get increased damage when you stab someone with a dagger, but then not use daggers? You know what I mean? And also they're daggers. It's not like a particularly difficult weapon to have more of, right? Why is it relevant that the sneak attack damage is now lower with other weapons? Sometimes I feel like game designers do this because they want to hammer home that it's intended to be like you just always use daggers. Like, that's the intention. But I feel like you're really hitting the player over the head with it. It's called the Knife Master subclass. The feature lists 8 different kinds of knives. It increases the damage you're dealing. Surely if the player does it just once, they'll see that rolling a bunch of d8s instead of a bunch of d6s feels way better, and they won't use a longsword just because the base damage number is better. But maybe I'm giving people too much credit. Maybe in playtesting, a ton of people still used a hand axe to do sneak attack damage or something. So they made it this way so they wouldn't. I don't know. It's weird. It's only a sentence long, but it's just text that makes me wonder why. This feels like it misunderstands why someone would choose this feature. Anyway, lots of games do this, and I really don't know why, so that's my best guess. Anyway, however, EyePatchNotes says there's something missing from here. By dismissal or oversight, the size of the knife that you stab enemies with is not capped. The driven player could leave weapon finesse at the door and come in with a huge dagger, medium +2, and have a 1d8 base damage, same as the Knife Master's sneak attack dice. Yes, they will eat a -4 penalty because it's a huge dagger, and have to use strength to swing it, but effects that listen for base damage will only enjoy a top end of 8 rather than a top end of 4. You increase your base damage die for things that care about that. Besides, flanking fixes the penalty, right? Yeah, exactly. Come on, man. It's just chance to hit. Just hit them. What are you, inaccurate? Just hit the enemy. It's not a big deal. What are you, poor on accuracy? I think this is totally reasonable. Yeah. So this is an interesting example that we're going to come back to a lot in this parlay of where it kind of feels like size is the exception for a lot of these features. They're very restrictive except for size. Now, I don't play Pathfinder, and so I don't know exactly how reasonable it is that you're trying to have everything use, your solution for all these cases is going to be larger weapons, basically, or smaller weapons. I don't know how doable that is. You could cast magic that changes their size, I would assume. But I mean, if it's not easy to find huge daggers, for example, yeah, that's one thing. I think if you're running a game and you're a fun game master, this is a really good role playing idea. I wrote down a little prompt that was like, go raid the ogre camp because the blacksmiths here don't know how to make larger weapons with the form factor that you learned to use to stab people better. Your, fighting technique that you learned requires daggers, like something that is shaped like a dagger, but the blacksmiths aren't going to make huge daggers. So it becomes economical, reasonable for your adventuring party to go steal them from an ogre camp that just has daggers of that size. That's kind of cool. It feels like the mechanics have become part of the gameplay, and your build can just pursue its seemingly contrived build thing by doing something storytelly as well. I think that's a lot of fun. So I don't know. You could say one of the strengths of a role-playing game like this is if your player is EyePatchNotes and they're super into this, you can just say that there are readily available huge daggers, but you have to do something to get them. Which in a way I think is fun. Like if this is interesting and not super overpowered, it's not. You basically just gain the ability to use rapiers, but still do the sneak stab thing. But you have to use these giant daggers instead. I have some concerns about the weight of anyway, whatever. I think that's cool. Maybe not an issue. Bug, not a feature. But I thought it was worth pointing out. Some people who play Pathfinder might be thinking, well, you can't just get weapons of totally different sizes. I don't know. I would kind of argue it doesn't really matter. It's a role-playing game, so you can add encounters in where you can get those things if it's really that, relevant / interesting. And I think it is relevant / interesting. That sounds cool. That's a fun idea. Section 3, this is called Declared Deity. Any given deity will have a weapon associated with their edicts, a so-called favored weapon. Maybe their symbol is the trident. Some mechanics listen for a deity's favored weapon only, such as the Crusader's Flurry feat that permits unexpected by the system weapons to be used for a monk's flurry of blows, normally only with punches. We can pursue that particular rabbit another time. If the character is locked into a specific weapon due to their concept, size, again, remains as an avenue to manipulate damage or handedness. Consider that weapons are strength-based as the systemic default. Medium longswords strike for 1d8 and large longswords for 2d6. Either can leverage the 1.5x strength clause when held in two hands. A -2 penalty is applied for each step away from the wielder's size, though, and weapons with a penalty that is greater than -4 are impossible to wield. Halfling greatswords can still be used by humans at a -2 penalty, or -4 by ogres. Ogres would not be able to use halfling daggers, and halflings are unable to use ogre greatswords. Well, I mean, I'm sure they can pick them up or whatever, but just not use them as a dagger or greatsword. An ogre could throw a halfling dagger as a, I don't know, tiny needle that does 1 damage, something like that. Well, I don't know how much damage I would say that does. You get the point. And here's where this table probably is the most helpful in my judgment. We're going to use some of it, the crit part, in section 5. But for now, you can see that we have ways to visually indicate the systemic damage increase that I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the parlay. And how you can see a very regular bump up in damage. If you increase something from simple to martial, well, now there's a requirement that it be, a bit more powerful, because getting it to be a martial weapon has a slight opportunity cost. One-handed instead of light or finesse, well, that's a little bit less versatile. And so, well, it is now versatile, but it can't be used as a light weapon, that meaning of versatile. And so it's going to go up 1 damage die again. It's two-handed, that's even more of an opportunity cost. It goes up 1 damage die again. That all makes sense. And then when you get to the weird ones, I like that they're called exotic weapons. It just gets strange. They get other benefits instead of just straight up increasing their damage die, except for the Butchering Axe, which just does increase its damage die. So that's a whole situation. I don't have too much else to say about this. We added the little clause in this section that mentions how the weapon can be up to 2 sizes wrong, and what you're losing from the weapon being the wrong size is, as far as I can tell, your accuracy. So when you say -2 penalty, -4 penalty, I think you mean to hit, not to damage, if I'm understanding correctly. I don't know how in Pathfinder, the damage calculation works. In 5th edition D&D, it would be your damage die plus your relevant modifier. And so for these, it sounds like it's just that to hit, you don't add, your relevant modifier. If you're attacking with strength, you add your relevant modifier, but minus this value. So you're attacking with strength, you add +4, let's say, you've got good strength, but you have to add -2 because the weapon is, one size larger. You can imagine that even with high strength, if you use a weapon 2 sizes too large, then your strength bonus to hit has basically been nullified. But I would assume it still applies to damage, just from a role-playing perspective. Maybe it doesn't. That matters. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. Okay, so the next section I want to do is, I don't have too much to say about that one. The main thing is just the idea that, again, this is a workaround for the weapon that you have. For some reason you have the ability to use a martial or maybe exotic weapon because your deity allows it. They're specifically favoring that weapon, and so you're allowed to use it even though you wouldn't normally have had proficiency from being a cleric or whatever. But in exchange, that does kind of limit what damage die the weapon has. It might increase it a little, but then you wouldn't be able to manipulate it as easy beyond that. You can't upgrade. You got 2 hands free, but the only martial weapon you're proficient with is the one your deity likes. But you can still potentially upgrade its damage by increasing its size. That idea. I think the handedness thing is slightly breaking my brain, like which weapons are allowed to be versatile, like used in 2 hands. It kind of feels to me like when a weapon increases in size, that should mean that you have to hold it with 2 hands. But I sort of get why that isn't the case too. Anyway, a little note from me there that my game design brain is slightly broken at that. I would want a better solution for that were I designing this system, but maybe it's actually very clear and I just don't of course I don't get it because I haven't played this game. I want to talk about this cleric example. Exhibit B, EyePatchNotes says, is a cleric of a deity who favors scythes, which are martial weapons in Pathfinder. Scythes are 1d8 two-handed weapons with 5% crit chance, so you roll a 20 on a d20, but a 4x crit multiplier. Whoa. Because scythes are two-handed, two-weapon fighting is not on the table, unless, can you think of what will make two-handed fighting on the table, two-weapon fighting on the table for scythes? The player takes an undersized scythe, which steps down the category from two-handed to one-handed at a -2 accuracy penalty. The crit profile is kept intact, meaning the character could even dual-wield scythes at a yet steeper penalty and fish for a big payoff. Is a cleric who wields 2 undersized weapons a heretic or a true devotee? Right, are they twice as pious because they're using twice the favored weapon of their deity? Or is it heretical because they're not using the right, it's not the right symbology, it's not the right size? This is really cool. So you can see that point I was just making about when a weapon is one or two-handed. Like I definitely get that if you made a scythe mini, well, now it's like a sickle or a kama. Sure, there are like one-handed scythe-esque weapons, like part of kusarigama or something, and you can, use it as a one-handed weapon. I get that. At the same time, you're making it sound like there is a systematized way in which the game will say, oh, if it goes down by one size, you can use it as a one-handed weapon if it was a two-handed weapon. If that's very regular, I'll drop the issue. It might be that this is actually not a problem at all in Pathfinder, and you just haven't focused on it too much in this parlay, which makes sense. It's a minor nitpick that I'm majorly picking. I think it's relevant, that's all. But it's intuitive that if the scythe is two-handed, you make it smaller, now it's one-handed. Like, that makes total sense to me. Having your one-handed weapon and then it goes up in size, but that doesn't make it two-handed. Anyway, that's, or it not necessarily makes it two-handed. You get the idea. The idea that you can take a weapon that has good damage on average, but the problem is that the damage isn't that reliable. Like, the crit chance is low. And so even though the crit multiplier means that over time you will get the crits and the average damage will be good, it's so spiky that there will be times when that ends up being a problem. And the idea that you fix this by dual wielding them is super cool. You get more hits, potentially for less damage individually or less accuracy. But if you get the crit, if you hit automatically when you crit in this game, then yeah, you it'll help even it out. It'll help leverage that damage. I'm tempted to say it makes it feel a little less unique, but you're still building around the 4 times critical multiplier. Like, that's very appealing to me. So I can get behind that. I think that's cool. The idea that you wouldn't be able to fit a weapon in the amount of hands that you have free in your build, and then you size it down or you get a smaller one. Again, it reminds me a little bit of this experience with Baldur's Gate 3 magic items. This would happen in your tabletop role-playing game too. You get a magic item that is two-handed, but has an ability you want, and so you want to be holding it, but you don't want to be having to commit both hands to it. You want to hold a shield or another magic weapon or whatever. And so you find a way to do it. To some extent, this is already a mechanic in Baldur's Gate 3. A thing that's come up a lot for me with my builds is that I want to dual wield 2 powerful weapons that are one-handed but are not light. So you can't dual wield them without a feat. And then I get the feat, which effectively means that I can have 2 of them equipped. Instead of 1 of them and a shield, I can now equip 2 of them. So it's a little bit similar. Like, I have a knob I can turn, an investment I can pay. That means I'm allowed to equip multiple of them. If you play Baldur's Gate 3, by the way, may I recommend dual wielding magic staves? Oh yes. Instead of your cleric or whatever, wielding a quarterstaff with some like bonus to their spell save DC. You know, they get more powerful magic from that one quarterstaff, but then they use a shield for the other weapon slot, the other hand. That's fine, but have you considered dual wielding quarterstaffs by taking the dual wielder feat? It'll probably increase your spell effectiveness by the same amount or more as if you took an ability score improvement, and the dual wielder feat in Baldur's Gate 3 gives you +1 AC, so you still get half the benefit of the shield. And yeah, you get to dual wield 2 quarterstaffs with really good magic in them innately, usually. They let you cast very powerful spells for free a few times a day, usually. Or they'll have some other weird buff, and they'll increase your spell save DC. It's particularly good for multi-classing, because your spells won't be based on the same stat for every, class. So like if you're a wizard and a warlock, well, your warlock spellcasting is charisma, and your wizard spellcasting is intelligence. But the staff just increases your spell performance across the board. So you profit on that if you have a mix of different classes. Well, I mean, you probably profit on that anyway, but I'm just saying even more than normal. That's really good. And it's also pretty badass to see your wizard dual wielding 2 giant rain sticks, and when they do an opportunity attack, clocking someone over the head twice with 2 long boys. It's a thing to behold. Very nice. Shadowheart, you're welcome. So yes, I really like the idea of getting a weapon that's kind of, if not supposed to be two-handed, you're kind of not normally able to wield 2 of them at the same time, and then it can be uniquely very satisfying to hit the table with a small hammer and dual wield them instead. Yes, I think this is a super cool idea. Again, another even more niche thing you might do is enable yourself to use a magic weapon or something with a property that you want to be able to use alongside another one, but normally can't equip at the same time. I don't know how many ways there are going to be to change the size of your weapons temporarily. Like if you have to use magic every single time, that sounds like it might be a bit of a problem. But I don't know. We'll see. What's the payoff, right? Maybe the innate spell in the weapon is enlarge, reduce. I don't know. You could work it out. Our final 5th section is the Devils in Details section. Exotic weapons make up the category beyond martial, gated behind a -4 non-proficiency penalty, again I assume to hit. Cleric and cleric-like classes enjoy proficiency in their deity's favored weapon. Some classes grant specific exotic proficiencies. Samurai and ninja get wakizashi proficiency, among others. But an exotic weapon otherwise expects the character to pay a feat tax. Remember, 5th edition folks, feats are more common in Pathfinder. You get more of them. It's still a cost, but it might seem like you can't even use these weapons without paying a whole feat just to use the weapon. That's more doable in Pathfinder. Glossing over Mathfinder crits in a parley not centered on them, the system approaches that of Warframe. A given weapon will have a damage die, crit chance, and crit multiplier. The common dagger has a base damage of 1d4, attempts a crit on a d20 roll of 19 or 20 because it's got 10% crit chance, and deals the basic 2x damage on a successful crit. And then those stats can be modified. So this is another knob the game can turn compared to like base damage die, handedness, size, etc. Longswords have been the repeated example as the crit profile is kept constant between daggers, short swords, great swords. We can more directly observe a predictable sort of dice progression there. But moving on to more complex weapon categories, simple to martial or handedness, light to one-handed, the power budget is there to move numbers around. And so that's where we start to see that, mostly the exotic weapons. Uniting the Parley's 3 topics, weapon-based damage kind of soft caps at 2d6 at the highest expected baseline without paying any cost. If the damage-minded player is not set on any particular weapon just because they want to, and they want big damage, the exotic Butchering Axe pushes damage to 3d6 and a juicy 3x crit multiplier, although it's only got 5% chance to crit. Players who devote themselves to a deity's weapon can use size dice progression to adjust their output, such as a large longsword still reaching the promised 2d6. If their deity favors longswords but they want a greatsword, they can make the longsword bigger or get a bigger longsword. Note that a player can almost build their own exotic weapons this way, and to fight back against dexterity being too dominant of a stat, finessable weapons are intentionally kept away from 2d6, though they can still have dex promoting their damage. Right, and so you can see through this table that not only through the crit scaling thing, but also through changing weapon size, you could potentially get a lot of damage scaling, even out of a weapon that you were restricted to use. Even if, we've been using the example of, your deity likes longswords, you want to use a longsword, that's the martial weapon you have proficiency with, but you want more damage and so you make it bigger. Another example would be, you have wakizashi proficiency, and the crit rate is really good. It's got more crit chance than normal, and you want to keep that, but it's only 1d6 actual damage die, so you make it bigger, keeping the crit chance, I would assume, and then increasing the damage die. Right, you can keep the sort of unique properties of the weapon that way. The Butchering Axe makes me think, wow, that crit is going to be spicy. If you double the 3d6, that's going to get out of control. There was actually a side note about that I wanted to point out a little bit. There's sort of this 2d6 figure. So I'm going to read that briefly. Asymptomatic says, note that the dice progression causes a 1d8 to grow into 2d6. I still don't understand this at all. This has come up a lot of times in several of the Parley. Why is 1d10 getting skipped? I don't think I've ever seen a weapon on these sheets that says 1d10. I feel like sort of an idiot. I don't know why that happens. You've said before that it does go from 1d8 to 2d6, but I don't understand why. There's kind of some mathematical reasons. The base die is 1d8, so you move 2 steps when moving forward. I understand that, but it just seems that seems extremely arbitrary. It both does and doesn't make sense mathematically. That's what this is. This is why I wanted to redo this. So I'll explain. 1d8 to 1d10, 1d10 to 2d6, there's some underwhelming math gains there, yes, but 1d8 to 2d6 causes this to happen. A 3x crit with 1d8 results in 3d8. A 3x crit with 2d6 results in 6d6. So this draws up the emphasis that 1d8 to 2d6 increase the minimum, the maximum, and the average rolls all at once. And then because you're multiplying the dice when you get that 3x crit, your 2d6 advantages over 1d8 is magnified quite dramatically. I don't really feel like this accomplishes a lot relative to just having it be 1d10 and having there be a clear pattern. Instead, it's not as underwhelming to go 1d8, 1d10, 2d6, but instead it's way overwhelming. Is that really better? I don't know. Because of the multiplicative nature of the crits, I feel like that just makes it even less balanced, but I don't know. I mean, it's good damage. Crits are fun. If it's going to do a lot of damage, I guess it could just do a lot of damage. I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about this design. It's not bad for things to be powerful, and I don't want to promote if I say balanced and then I talk like I want things to be weaker, people are going to do that stupid thing where they go, like balanced means everything is boring. Like, no, I'm just worried that there isn't really a good reason to do it one way or the other. That's all. I don't care whether the good reason is stronger or weaker. I just care about there being like a reason that feels sensible to me. It doesn't actually matter if I understand it. But 2d6 is already pretty rare, is the point of this part. EyePatchNotes says most weapons lack the power budget to go one more step, great swords already being martial and two-handed. One-handed 1d8 weapons are perhaps the most interesting profile to me, since they can be played straight to good effect or pushed a little bit more. Enlarge person, as a pre or in combat buff, temporarily gets you to reach the promised land of 2d6. Sure, I mean, again, I think what frustrates me about this example is that it feels like a place where the pattern breaks for not enough of a clear game design benefit. Like it doesn't have to not continue the pattern from my perspective. And it does, and that makes the thing stronger, and that's fine. But I just don't, that adds a lot of complexity to what was otherwise a perfectly neat pattern. And I don't feel mathematically that there is a reason really for that. Again, I understand that if it was 1d8 to 1d10 to 2d6, there are some reasons why that's mathematically a little underwhelming, but I don't know, it feels off to me. That feels very arbitrary to me, that's all. It's not your fault. And you make an interesting point, because that is how it works. You really draw up the advantages of going from 1d8 to 2d6 when you crit or when you increase the size potentially. Because as we were mentioning before, if we start at 1d8, when we move up in size, in this case, we're jumping 2 steps. And so 1d8, we go to 2d6. Now, what if you make it bigger again? You go to 3d6. So you can get that. Imagine if it starts as the butchering axe. I don't know what happens there. You could be getting a massive, massive increase, really magnifying the might have seemed like not huge difference between 1d8 and 1d10 and 1d8 and 2d6. You're really magnifying that a lot of times by increasing the size. Now you end up with 3d6, and suddenly the difference is pretty enormous. If it hadn't been 1d8 to 2d6 and it was instead 1d8 to 1d10, you would only be at 2d6, and now you've got 3d6, which is a fairly substantial damage boost. Yet mathematically, it kind of a little bit made sense at first, but then as you magnify the difference, it feels more significant. That's interesting. And yes, having a large person be a meaningful combat buff is fascinating. I had an NPC in a campaign that I ran for a few friends of mine a couple of years ago, where this NPC's gimmick was that they could change size a lot in both directions. They could go from tiny to huge, tiny, small, medium, large, huge. They could be anywhere from tiny to huge, not too many times a day, but a few times a day, which is incredibly strong. If you're tiny, you're basically impossible to spot, provided you try to hide. And then you can suddenly be huge and be using what weapons if you can get them into your hand, from when you were tiny, or picking up like a house and hitting people with it, by comparison, when you were like an ant before. It was an interesting dynamic, but this character was very unmotivated. And so I made my players decide the plan for them, basically. Like, they were very not tactically minded. This was a fae, and they were kind of a prankster. They didn't really care very much about the tactical impact of the effect. They said, I usually just go huge and beat the crap out of people. And my players, I was very happy to hear say, oh, come on, you could do so much more with that. Like, what's going on? And I would be interested. I'm keen on the role-playing implications of this size change thing. Like, what about using sizedness to conceal weapons? Something that might have looked like an innocuous dagger, suddenly sizing up to be like a gigantic, oversized greatsword, really changes the impression that you give to people socially. Makes you look from a run-of-the-mill adventurer into like Guts from whatever that series is called. I am legitimately forgetting the name, but you know what I'm talking about. Cloud, I don't know. Final Fantasy's Cloud, whatever. I think that's an interesting idea. It would be fun to roleplay lots of size changing. And it's the kind of thing that I feel like as much as I'm totally sold on the interesting mechanical uses for this, I'm not trying to say that EyePatchNotes isn't doing something super powerful, so let's just give it to everyone. I think it sounds very fun, and you've convinced me there are some potent use cases, but I still think that the size increase and decrease thing is an only moderate power increase, and so it feels nice to increase how common that is, like how many ways you can do that. I would be interested, for example, in something like a cantrip for magical martial characters, rangers, maybe artificers, that for one turn changes the size of like a weapon or an object by one category. Maybe it's a bonus action or something. Maybe it has a cooldown. That's in Baldur's Gate 3 a little bit, that sometimes cantrips will still have a cooldown, so they don't cost anything to use now, but you can only use them once per short rest or something. That could be a way to do it. Something like a mini enlarge reduce that lets you do it as a normal part of combat. Maybe you don't always swing a melee weapon, but when you do, you want to exploit sizedness somehow. I think a way to manipulate that would be really fun. For example, a homebrew cantrip that I've added to my 5th edition kind of games is it's kind of like a mini magic missile. It's called Magic Dart. It just does 1 damage and it cannot miss. It has long range. It's like a very tiny magic missile that's just unmissable. If you need to do 1 damage to something to deliver a bunch of other damage potentially, or maybe to interrupt concentration, though that's not going to be that hard to pass. There's various uses for it. We've added a spell that is like the go-to. You just need to do any damage at all to something. This, does that, which is small, but it does add other character options that it's pretty hard to believe are going to get out of control, but it still offers that, that design space is opened up a little bit more. If you really just care about hitting something or finishing something off, or you're not going to do better damage with cantrips anyway, so would you rather have something that's more reliable? And then, it will scale when your proficiency bonus increases, when your cantrips get better, now you can fire 2 darts that do 1 damage each or whatever. And I might balance it up. We'll see. It's only been in a couple of games I've run so far. But the idea is that it adds that mechanic into the game a little more. When you see this much design space, all this design space EyePatchNotes presented for fun things you can do with sizedness with weapons, I kind of want to add a little bit more of it, I think that would be fun. So you've inspired me to fit that in somehow. I'm not sure. I don't love that cantrip idea. I kind of want something more. But Enlarge Reduce is already only a 2nd level spell. Yeah, but it is concentration. Yeah, anyway. Down with dexterity. I'm with you. I'm glad I got to share my. There's stats that are useful more often than other stats, and then there's dexterity. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I think we can all agree with that. I'm looking forward to finding out what this Witch of Contradiction build is.